Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show. I'm going to be talking to Luke today. And Luke is, I believe you're an ex-Christian, right? It wouldn't be right to currently call you a Christian. And he was in kind of like pretty kind of fundamentalist type sect. I came across this article he basically wrote about conversion therapy in a particular seminary that he was attending, seminary or Christian university. And I guess we're going to talk about issues around how evangelicals kind of think about sex, how to talk about these things, but then also Luke's personal experiences and story within there. So if I suppose to introduce yourself, how did you come about writing that article that I've linked in? I forgot what the magazine's name was, RVA or RVA?
RVA magazine, yeah. RVA. So I initially had written a much longer article that part of what you see actually in RVA magazine was part of this longer article, which was building on a first article that I had published through Queerty in January of this year. And it was this longer piece just about liberty. And at first I was doing my best to separate myself from liberty, because of course on my CV it says Liberty University, and that's not a selling point. And so I started writing about my experience, and I started writing about conversion therapy specifically because I think that's perhaps the one of the really dark underbellies of the university is the conversion therapy program that they don't advertise. A lot of actually conversion therapy programs don't advertise directly. They use a lot of euphemisms. They use a lot of rhetorical gymnastics to talk about, to advertise what they do, and they don't necessarily say we're trying to make you attracted to women. They instead use, other sort of, rhetorical maneuvers or whatnot. And so I did my best, and I'm doing my best to show what Liberty does, and specifically how it treats its students, more particularly how it treats its queer students on campus. And so I wrote these articles, and I've written a few since, just more broadly about Liberty, not necessarily just about conversion therapy, but also about the former president, Jerry Falwell Jr., who's been in the news. And I've since begun actually applying for postdoctoral positions with the project of doing a queer history of Liberty. So doing my best to expose Liberty for what it does and how it treats its students.
So taking a step back then, before we get into like all that stuff that you experienced, how did you, because you were just saying before this that when you were around 14, you chose to become a Christian. And do you want to talk about what that journey was? Like what kind of happened in your life, or what series of events? And then what was the kind of culture like that you were in? And also like that, did you know at this point that you were gay? How did that jive with kind of the teachings that were going on in the church? Do you want to talk about all those sorts of things?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I was raised in a family where my mom took us to church when we were little, up until about grade 2 or 3, and then we stopped going. My dad wasn't a Christian, and so I had some exposure, and it was to a Baptist church. It was more particularly Fellowship Evangelical Baptist Church in Toronto, not too far from my house. And so when we were little, we went to that church, but again, we stopped going, and I didn't really know too much ultimately about Christianity. I knew enough, from Sunday school and from church when I was little, but really it was a surface level understanding. So grade 8, going into grade 9, the summer between grade 8 and grade 9, my brother got really into creation versus evolution. And this conversation about origins fascinated me. And I started watching all these DVDs with my brother, and then I started going to these websites and checking out what these who was talking about what in this field or arena, I don't know what you call it. And surely enough, at the end of exploring both sides, more so leaning towards the creationist side, because my brother was leaning more so towards the creationist side, I decided that if I believe that there is a creator, if I believe there is an intelligent designer, then I need to go figure out who that creator or intelligent designer is. And of course, with my background in the church, I decided that I was going to go to that church again. So I said to my mom one morning, I woke her up and I was like, "Hey mom, can we go to church?" And she was like, "No, come on, leave me alone," or whatever. I was like, "Come on, please go to church." So she's like, "Fine, we'll go to church." So we went to church. And in the bulletin, I saw that there was a youth group. And we were sitting in the balcony. I looked down and I saw the youth group who was sitting in the same spot from when I was a kid, where my older brother used to sit when I was, younger, and he was a part of the youth group. I saw them all sitting there. I was like, oh my gosh, I remember him. I remember her. Vague memories. And so that Wednesday was youth group. So on Monday morning after church, I went to school. I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, like a very artsy school. And I went into art class, visual art class. And I said to my friend Becky, I said, hey, Becky, do you want to go to church with me? And she was like, fuck yeah, I do. And so we were like, let's go. And so we went to church, and youth group, and on Wednesday. And then I just didn't stop going for about, I didn't stop going throughout high school. And I went to Sunday morning services. I went to youth group. I went to all the other, special events and whatnot. I started going to the winter retreats or the different youth retreats they had. Then I started going to camp. So from, Beacon Bible Camp to Joy Bible Camp to all these different, camps that I was at. I started, becoming more and more involved, and even to the point where I was involved in the leadership program-ish thing at the school. And then I decided when I was there that I wanted to go to Liberty. But at first, I was raised, again, I'm a Canadian, and so I was raised on a very strict anti-American diet from my dad. Like, we did not like America in our household. And so I had no plans to go to the States. But my uncle, who he was working for Liberty, he was the national recruiter in Canada. Technically he's my mom's cousin, so whatever that makes him in relationship to me. But we just call him Uncle Gary. And so Uncle Gary said, why don't you come down to Liberty for a trip? And I was like, no, thank you. Like, I don't really want to go to Virginia. And he was like, no, you'll have fun. Just try it out. So I was like, oh, so I went down and I loved it. And then I had decided that I wanted to go there. And that was in grade 11. Liberty had accepted me really early. Right. And so I had in my mind that I wanted to go to Liberty. But to backtrack to your question about sexuality and the church, and in part what drew me, I think in large part, I think about it today. I was talking to my sister and I was saying, like, I feel goofy now to think that I, was so easily, in a lot of ways, what I feel now is being tricked into it. But I think we were chatting, and she said, like, what do you think, drew you into it? And I've been thinking about this for years, right? Because again, like, what was it that made me susceptible to buying into this system that actively negated who I am as a person, as a queer person, but more generally, just as a person in general, right? Or more generally in general. I think about this a good amount now, and I think, what motivated me to go to Liberty, what motivated me in the first place to even become an evangelical. And I think in large part, rigid doctrines or rigid understandings of any faith, and I know Christianity the best, I suppose. It provides some sort of framework. It provides some sort of safety, right? Where you feel that you have all the answers. When I was an evangelical, I thought I knew everything. And I thought when I was going to go down to Liberty even, I was like, what do they have to teach me? I already know everything I need to know. And especially from an American, how dare they try to teach me anything? And so I thought I had all the answers. I thought that I knew where I was going for eternity. I thought I knew what was right, what was wrong, what was of God, what was of the enemy. And when you have that binary understanding of the world is simpler. The world is easier to navigate. And I think that for me, it was a question between, do I choose God or do I choose my sexuality? Because not to say that all Christian theologies have that sort of dual opposition, but evangelicalism and fundamentalism certainly does, right? You have to choose. Do you choose yourself or do you choose God? And that's the way it's framed. It's not, and I don't even think that the question should be framed that way. I think that's like a mistake from the beginning of exploring these different parts of who you are and what makes you you. And so for me, I decided that if in fact I am to believe in this God that I profess to believe in, I have to choose God over my sexuality. Because, the idea of dying to self and taking up your cross, these were, of course, verses that led me in that direction to the point where I negated a pretty significant part of who I am. And I'm not saying my sexuality is everything, because it's not, but it is part of who I am. And it is part of, even my gender expression, right? Like I don't know, like I'm certainly no football player, but and I think that for me was also regulated. That for me was monitored in some ways, where I remember the first time I went I had decided I was going to join the dance company at my high school.
Right.
Pardon me, it was before the dance company. It was when I was just choosing that I wanted to dance at my high school. I went to my youth pastor and I said, "Hey, I'm thinking about joining the dance or taking a dance class at my school as one of my academic credits." And he literally looked at me and said, "Why?" And, you know, now, I mean, dancing is one of my absolute favorite activities. I absolutely love to do it both on stage and, well, not so much on stage anymore. I wouldn't really want to do that anymore. I don't think I'm all that great. But, you know, I love to dance. And so this idea that dancing, a very like fundamental part of like human culture, you know, transcultural sort of phenomenon, that this is something that all people do, regardless of gay, straight, whatever, that was questioned, right? Like even just little things like that. So for me, it was this larger, I think ultimately looking back and again, questioning what motivated me to join this church and then ultimately to really subscribe to the belief system was I think that it was safe. I think that as a kid, you know, of course, like even in 2020, like it's still hard for a lot of folks to come out. Even though I was living in Toronto, considered the most multicultural city in the world by some, you know, and going to art school, nonetheless, right? Like as if like it wasn't clear that I was not straight. And I think that for me, I was still terrified to come out for a few reasons. Mostly because of my mom, and my mom has turned out to be exactly what I thought she was, which is a complete and total homophobe. And there's that. Right. But putting her aside, I mean, like, you know, when you're a kid, you want to fit in, you want to be normal. And not to say evangelicalism is normal, particularly not in Toronto and particularly not at Rosedale Heights School of the Arts. But I think that that framework of being straight and saying we have the option for you to be straight, because I knew that there were, you know, people talking about if someone's you know, struggles with same-sex attraction, which is the language that they use when you're referring to someone who's gay, that they talk about there's a way out for these people, that you can you can find attraction to women. So I knew that going into it, and as a result, I think that I chose evangelicalism because I wanted to be quote unquote normal. I wanted to fit in the way that everyone else did, and it was offering me some sort of some semblance of normalcy by being straight. And I think that for me was a big motivating factor, though at the time I wasn't thinking about it in these terms, I don't think. But looking back, I think that's what I would probably say that drew me to evangelicalism. And on top of that, I think also just questions of faith and spirituality still do interest me. I'm still fascinated by those conversations. So I think both an intellectual curiosity and also and a spiritual and moral and ethical curiosity, but on top of that, a sense of safety and a sense of concrete, absolute truth answers were attractive. So,
and then for you, so during this time when you're talking about finding this kind of certainty in Christianity, that helped you to make sense of things, was that more like a subconscious sort of you know, feeling different or feeling like life's more complicated and stuff like that? Or was it like this conscious, like, no, like I'm gay and life is different for me or something, you know, like were you aware, or did you just have like kind of like feelings towards guys, say, and not towards girls, and you were kind of like, well, I'm not sure how I deal with this? Or were you like, because I know for some people, maybe they realize either in like a deconstruction of their faith process or when they're older, they're like, oh yeah, I had these feelings for the same sex all throughout like childhood. That's what that was, and I couldn't make sense of it. Is that the same for you, or were you like pretty, you know, for some other people it's like, you know, I just knew from age 5 or something, you know, like how is it for you?
I'm the guy who knew from age 5 as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I always knew I was attracted to men. I mean, I've like isolated the first time I think I remember being attracted to someone, which was around probably about 6 or 7. Right. But I absolutely knew. But the thing, and I think this goes, my experience of understanding my sexuality was filtered through first evangelicalism, and then now, of course, you know, my deconstructive lens. But for a long time, I had convinced myself, and I think had been convinced by other Christians, that that I wasn't gay, but I struggled with same-sex attraction. And so the phrasing that they use is SSA, same-sex attraction, and that divorces the individual from the attraction. So this idea within evangelicalism, within Christianity, really is the idea that everyone is latently heterosexual. And at any point that someone's gay, or struggles with same-sex attraction, is that it's an aberration from that. And it's something that can be fixed. Because if in fact it's not part of who you are, if that's not intrinsic to your subjectivity or personhood, then of course that's something that can be changed. Similar to how a disease can be, handled, or I don't know, maybe a demonic possession or something that's not necessarily you. And so the way that they describe it in evangelicalism and in gay conversion therapy more generally, though of course most gay conversion therapists are religious, but not all, to be sure. And of course there are different conversion therapies across religions and whatnot. So the way that they understand it is that at its core, it's not a sexuality issue, that me being gay is actually at its base a gender issue. So the argument goes that it's not that I am gay, it's that I didn't align with the quote unquote capital M masculine or man, and I don't identify as a man. And because I didn't identify properly according to a certain, hegemonic, heteronormative straight script, that I veered away from that. The way to get me back on it is just to realign my gender identification. So if I am only to play football, if I am only to hang out with men the way that men are supposed to hang out with each other, which of course is just like this cultural dominant understanding of masculinity, then I can realign my gender identification so as to realign my sexuality. And I can still remember in my conversion therapy manual, I was assigned Alan Medinger's growth into manhood, resuming the journey. So even that, like the metaphor of a journey and like veering off and growth back into manhood, if I need to grow into proper or full manhood, in there, he had instructed his readers to do things such as carpentry. And I was like, how Jesus of you? Like, what do men do? They do carpentry. Another guy who he's from, I think it's called Quest Ministries in Atlanta, Georgia. He also talks about, he says, not all you have to do, but he says, one way to align with men is if you are to, what did he say? If you are to read the sports section every morning, and then when you go and hang out with your buddies, go and talk about it, and soon enough, you're going to love sports. And you're like, what kind of alchemy is that? Like, I don't know if it works like that. Have you tried trying to get me interested in football? It's just probably not going to happen, even if I read enough sports sections. And so these were like the tactics, right? So it's this idea of performing, of doing, that it's not so much who you are, because again, who you are is straight, but it's if you are to do these other things, that's going to get you back in line and where you need to be.
And so did it always kind of, was there much of this in the church beforehand, like this kind of, before you went to university and there's this whole program of conversion therapy, was there much like, here's like a set of behaviors for you to adopt, like here's how here's how we as like a community of churchgoers or whatever can almost like, because it's not necessarily articulated like this, but maybe like can put pressure on you in certain ways to behave. And was that always there from, and how did you internally, did you think, yes, this is how God wants me to behave, so I've got to behave that way against how I feel, or what was going on there?
Well, leading into Liberty, no one knew. Well, I think people knew, they just didn't. It was like the open secret, right? Where Luke's straight. It's one of those. I think that no one knew explicitly that I was gay. No one. I had not told anyone, and so because of that, there was no. I don't think there was any intentional effort per se. Though when I do look back and I think about the people in my church in high school, I do sometimes think that there was like, I remember this one time. There was one guy who he came over to my, I had left, I had gone to Liberty, and this is actually post Liberty, but he came to my place in Hamilton, Ontario, which is where I was doing my MA. And I was there, and he came over with his girlfriend at the time, and they just kept talking about like, oh, Luke, you're such a man's man. You're such a manly man. And it was like, what? Like, no, I'm not. Like, where is this coming? And it was just this like very forced, affected, bizarre moment where I remember being like, after they left, I was like, what the heck was that? Like, why did they kept emphasizing me being really manly and like, oh, you're such a, it was bizarre. And like, I even saying it now, I'm like I feel uncomfortable thinking about it. But I think that there was this way of putting pressure on me to, or maybe like a way of affirming me without, or affirming me in my masculinity and my manhood as a way to preemptively, or because they knew deep down or not so deep down that I'm gay. I think that there was this push for me to perform a certain way. And, you know, in church and in a lot of Christian, parachurch organizations or universities like Liberty, all this kind of stuff, a lot of the activities are separated by gender. And so you have guys are doing one thing, gals are doing another thing. And so I think that it's kind of built into the system in a way, but I don't necessarily know if I can say that there were people who were actively pushing me in that direction, though I can say that there were times where it felt like it, and looking back, it was just straight up so bizarre.
Yeah.
Like so bizarre.
So then going to this university then at that point, were you aware that you were aware of the program? Was that like a deciding factor in going? Like you wanted this as part of your spiritual journey or something? Or is that? Yeah,
the way that it worked was that I went down to Liberty 6 times before I had I went there to study. I had gone down on what they call College for a Weekend, which is these weekend trips where you get on a charter bus and you drive on down to Virginia through the night, and then you get there for like 3 days and then you go back home. So I did this a bunch of times because I thought it was so fun. Meanwhile, looking back, like when you're 16, 17, you know, these are the things you do. And so I went down on these trips. And when I was there, I had found out, because in Convocation, which is their chapel service, you go to chapel service, and there are 4 screens in this basketball stadium. Liberty's huge. Liberty's the largest evangelical university in the world. And so largest Christian university in the world. It's one of the it's like, I think the 5th biggest university in America because of its online program, which of course is separate and different from its residential program, but nonetheless, it's a pretty sizable university. And so when I went down to Liberty for one of these trips, I saw on one of the screens after Convocation, after chapel, which is on these screens, they would, what's the word? They would be filming it so you could see the people who were speaking at the front of the stage, because the place is so big that you could look up at these screens. Afterwards, they had these, what are those called? Announcements. So university announcements. So things that were going on campus that weekend, or things that were going on, whatever. And one of the announcements I saw was this. It said, "Are you struggling with same-sex attraction?" And I was like, guilty. And so I saw that, and I wrote down the guy's name, who was the one who led this group, because what it said was, well, I don't know if it was for the group or if it was for the individual therapy. I don't actually remember which one, but it was something along the lines of, are you struggling with same-sex attraction? Like, reach out to Pastor Dane Emmerich. So I wrote his name down, and then later on, of course, I went and looked him up, and I saw who he was, and I saw what he did. But wait a second. Let me just make sure I'm not missing.
Yeah, sure.
No, I didn't look him up. Pardon me. I wrote his name down, but then I went and I went to my friend John, and I said, "Hey, like, who's this Pastor Dane guy?" And I think that he had this reputation on campus. And so people knew him as the guy who worked with both people who were struggling with porn addictions and those who were struggling with same-sex attraction. So I was in the know of who this guy was. So that was part of what influenced me ultimately to go to Liberty. I mean, Liberty also at a certain point, they gave me a pretty sizable scholarship to go, and that allowed me to go. But what motivated me to go? When I was making actually my decision, I was thinking between a university here in Toronto or Liberty, and I had this little like tally. So like one check for Liberty if it was for this section or for this this pro, one for University of Toronto, one for Liberty, whatever. The only thing I gave 2 checks for was Liberty, because pardon me, was the conversion therapy program.
Yeah.
Because that was, and again looking back, thinking like that was obviously twice as important as anything else to me. So that ultimately wasn't necessarily what tipped the scales to go to Liberty, but it certainly was something that was pretty important. Yeah. And so I certainly knew about the program. That was again a large motivating reason why I went, and off I went down to the old LU.
And then so how did was there like a first time that you went to like a session or something? And what I suppose in kind of like talking about that, is there a point at which you started to think, I don't know, maybe like this is too far, or this is like not a therapeutic or abusive in some way, or like how, because like when I reflect back on some, say, like what one-to-ones and things that I had that were under the guise of like helping me, say, with depression stuff when I was a Christian, but I look back at some of the conversations and I kind of think, well, actually, this person wasn't like a clinical psychologist. It was just some kind of someone using their theology to try and advise me. But some of the ways that they dealt with things were actually quite harmful psychologically, and quite it might be that you come out and say, actually, no, they were really good. So I don't know at this point, like, what was it like at first, and was it good or bad, or what were the practices like?
So what happened was that I had this, like, if we can call it, I guess, like a romantic encounter with someone on my dorm, my spiritual life director on my dorm, one of them. And he wouldn't talk to me afterwards. And my big plan for going to Liberty was that I was going to go down, and I wasn't going to go to conversion therapy right away. Again, I wanted to go. That was certainly part of the plan. But the plan was that I was going to go down and date Christian guys for however long, have my fun, and then at the end of my 4 years, find a wife, go to conversion therapy, find a wife, and off I'd go and live a life.
Okay.
I don't remember. That was my big plan.
Yeah.
Because my big thing was that I didn't want to ruin my Christian witness. I didn't want to date non-Christian guys and then have them say to me, "Wait a second, aren't you a Christian?" I thought that was going to be giving Jesus a bad name, and so I thought, I can't do that with non-Christians, but I can do that with Christians. And of course, if this is a big, Christian university, there's got to be some other guys like me. And so I was going to go down, and that was my big plan to, go date Christian guys. And that didn't work out so well. But what happened was, I met this guy, on my dorm, and he, after, our weird encounter, he says to me, he's like, he said, we're not talking about this. Like, there's no need to talk about this. And I was, blown away, because this was my first, romantic anything. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I was so upset. I was so distraught. And so I certainly didn't have anyone back home to talk to, right? Like, I wasn't out to any of my friends or family back home. And I also wasn't out to anyone at Liberty either. And so for me, it was this question of, what do I do? Who do I talk to? And so I decided we need to fast track this 4-year plan and start going to conversion therapy. And so
I see.
Yeah, right. So I emailed Pastor Dane, and I made up a fake email. I was like, what's like the most different email I could possibly think of, so as to not have him ever come out and investigate and find out it is I who sent this email. So I made up a fake email. It was something like Texas football fan or something like that, like the kid from Canada versus Texas football fan. And so I messaged him and I said, hey, if I'm to come talk to you, do I have the chance of being reported? Do I have the chance of getting in trouble? Do I have the chance of getting kicked out? Will my mom find out? Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And he responded back, nope, this is completely confidential. So I felt, of course, safe going into that that space. And so I went. I still remember what I was wearing. I remember where I was, waiting in this dark. It was called a prayer room, which his office was connected to the prayer room. And I'm sitting there waiting for him to finish up his meeting with this other guy. And so he does. And then he says, like, Luke, and I was like, or Lucas, I think is what he called me, which is, I think, anyway. So he, come on in. So we go in, we sit down, and I mean, this is the thing. I think that, if you've seen films like Boy Erased, or if you've, read memoirs like Garrett Conley's Boy Erased, or, other accounts of conversion therapy, I'm thinking specifically of Sam Brinton from the Trevor Project. He has a lot of videos about discussing him, or he's in these videos, he's discussing his experience and really awful experiences. And mine was not good either, but it wasn't physically harmful, right? It wasn't like I was, even I didn't even have to do calisthenics or go do exercises with other men, because that's very effective in turning people straight. And so I go to, and again, I'm sitting in this room, and again, throughout my 4 years, it was very similar. Pastor Dane Emmerich, he's this father figure. He's this very paternal, warm person in a lot of ways, which of course, if you're I guess this point I would have been 18, pardon me, an 18-year-old kid, and you have this guy who for the first time in your life, you've told, he wasn't the first person I told I was gay. There were people like on like MySpace and stuff.
Right.
that felt so like risky.
Yeah.
But he was the first person I really opened up to about my sexuality. And what happened, I mean, like, and when you have someone for the first time in your life who isn't judging you, when you have someone who you've told a really big part of you that you're wildly ashamed of, and he doesn't reject you, unlike the rest of the Christian community, or at least that you expect the rest of the Christian community to reject you if you are to reveal this information. It was this experience of feeling at the moment, or in the moment, validated, feeling not weird. And I think that was something that was so alluring. That was something that brought me in. And I think that he made me feel not weird. However, the flip side to all of this is this really guilt-based way of operating, in the sense that what we did, I can give like a quick picture as to like what a conversion therapy, like, session with him was like. And it was where we went in, and I mean, for the first few meetings, he was asking a lot of questions about my mom and dad, like how like strangely like Freudian he was. And a lot of them are, right? It's this narrative within conversion therapy that its mothers are overbearing and fathers are absentee or emotionally abusive or whatnot. Problem is, my dad,
they didn't hit you enough or something, like I've heard that kind of thing.
I'm not tough enough. I should have gotten beaten up a little bit more. And so the problem was that narrative half fit. My dad's phenomenal, so like that didn't fit. My dad was like this like absolute gem of a human. And then my mom is overbearing, and my mom is very much fits the bill.
We've solved it.
Yeah, right. And this is exactly it. It's this selective reasoning, or selective like use of evidence, where it's like
confirmation bias. You see 11:11 on the clock, but every time you look at the clock and it isn't 11:11, you just forget about that one.
That's exactly it. So it's like, your dad was great. Well, let's put that to the side. Let's not talk about that. But your mom was like this, and and other folks in your life were whatever fitting the narrative. Then so that was for me. That's how we started off these meetings. Pardon me. That was where we would talk about my family. We talked about my brothers. We talked about my sister. We talked about my friends and all these different folks in my life. And after that, what we would do is we read this book, Alan Mediger's Growth into Manhood: Resuming the Journey. And there were other books that other folks had. One book was called, I think it's like You Don't Have to Be Gay. And I was like, I don't know if I want that one. I can't carry that around. And big writing on the front of the cover. But so that was my manual. And we read that, or he would assign me chapters. I still have it. I actually don't know where it is. I've tried to find it recently, but I have the manual and I could find like my little underlines, my highlights and whatnot, which is so weird to see like what I thought was important back then. But so you had this manual, you had a lot of prayer, and he'd always lay his hands on you afterwards, which I thought about that as well. And like, why was he always like putting his hands on my leg or on my shoulder or whatever, like on my back? Very, very weird. But he did. And then he would ask me, about my failures and my victories. And what failures and victories were in this context were the things that I did that week that were fighting against my same-sex attraction. And then the things that when I failed, what I did that, what led to that? Why was I doing these things? Because I'm gay. But that we didn't talk about that as much. And so we went through these sessions where we would pray, talk about my failures and victories, talk about my family still, even though after the first meetings it was less emphasized, it was still talked about. And this is what we would do. And every week we would chat. And I think, again, so for me, like I would go into these experiences or into these sessions and feel validated. I'd feel like, I don't feel judged. I don't feel like someone's making me feel weird about this, even though everyone else, or seemingly it felt like everyone else would have made me feel that way. And of course you hear comments on campus, you hear comments from friends where people are talking about being gay. They even talk about like, Pastor Dane, who goes to those sessions. And I'm like, haha, no, I don't know. I don't know anyone who goes to those sessions. And I think that for me, when I think back on Pastor Dane, I think about how he made me feel really good in some ways, because again, it was a different approach to who I am as a person, and how he also guilted me a lot. Because again, when you have this paternal father-like figure, and you have someone who you emulate, right? Like you want to be like him. So he's like your, Freudian ego ideal. Like, oh, there's someone I want to be like. When you have someone like that and you mess up, or you have these failures, you don't want to go and report to him I did this. Again, it wasn't like he sat there and was like, shame, 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 or like, you should feel bad. But it was more so that you, again, like, just because you valued that relationship at the time, you didn't want to upset him. You didn't want to fail him. And so for me, it was a session. These sessions were filled with guilt. And of course, guilt is like when you've done one specific transgression that's bad, and you feel bad about it in that specific context, but you don't necessarily apply it to yourself as a human, as a person. Like, I did this, but again, that same-sex attraction it's not me. And so that's the sinful part, or like that same-sex attraction, or like what I do when I'm acting on that same-sex attraction, that's separate from who I am. So that makes it a guilt-based sort of approach to this quote unquote sin, versus shame, which of course is when you feel ashamed of yourself. It's where you as a person, as a human being, fundamentally you are like damaged or defective or wrong. And of course, for a long time where I just saw this as, oh, that's not me, that's not me, that's not me. And, the same-sex attraction or acting on it, it's not me, it's not me. But after a while, after like years and years and years of this, you start thinking, maybe this is me, like maybe this isn't just like a one-off action that I do every so often, and that I can like repress or suppress, pardon me, for X number of, days or weeks, or, maybe months, but probably not at that. No, I don't think I ever got to a month where I was, being a heterosexual. And so I think that when you realize that it's not working, when you realize these aren't discrete acts, these are a part of a pattern of acts and actions that are a function of your desires, you start thinking to yourself, well, not necessarily just that it's me. Again, that was something that came later, but it was more so, I'm messed up. I'm the problem. So this is where the shame comes in. So it's like, even though he was trying to say like, it's not you, like it's just these specific actions that are bad. After a while, you start really thinking, no, I'm pretty messed up because I can't get a hold of this. How come apparently all these other ex-gays are able to do this, yet I am not? And when you have this pattern of messing up over and over, you feel pretty terrible about yourself. And so, yes, Pastor Dane was this warm father-like figure. He was also someone who made me feel absolutely horrible about myself. Right. And I think that Pastor Dane, when I think about Pastor Dane, I think about conversion therapy. And when I think about conversion therapy in a broader sense, not just in the context of Liberty University with this man, Pastor Dane Emmerich, I think about it as, in this greater sense, as concentrated homophobia. That's cultural, that's religious, that's whatever. It's where you are able to say what homophobes across the world are able to say in a way that almost seems as loving. And I think that that's part of the violence. That's that part of the how insidious it is, because it's wrapped and packaged as care. It's wrapped and packaged as, we're looking out for you, we're doing what's best for you. Yet, of course, this is an ontological attack against who you are as a person. And I think that that's wildly sneaky, right? I think that's wildly also effective in why so many people go to conversion therapy as adults, not just as kids, right? Because it's not just a thing where parents force their kids to go. And for me, again, why did I do this? Because I thought this was all in the name of spiritual health, all in the name of being good and ultimately living a life of godly normalcy that certainly didn't happen.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something I notice in conversations is this idea of, well, I see a lot in the general broader cultural conversation. There's this idea that only Christians believe that truth exists or something, or things like love exist, and so they'll say, well, and if we believe in truth, and if we believe in loving our neighbor, then we're going to tell them the truth, and the truth is that they're living in and it's like this redefinition of love to something that's actually very harmful. I don't want to frame this wholly as an attack against like Christians or something, because there's plenty of Christians I know who are progressive and don't believe any of this stuff, and I think you can figure it out in a certain way where it is compatible. But certainly, like within that evangelical context, I do see that going on, where it's like legitimized almost, because it's like, well, I'm just loving my neighbor. I'm just whereas it's like, but you've completely distorted the word love in that context to the point where it's like abuse and psychologically harmful.
Well, I think about that too, and it's like, this idea that you'll have people like Pastor Dane, you'll have people. There's actually this article. It was the first was the first article that was written about being gay at Liberty by this man named Brandon Ambrosino, who's actually been doing a lot of really good investigative work on Liberty recently. But he has this article that I don't like this article. I think I like a lot of his later work, but his early work, it was in some ways saying Liberty, it's not as bad as you think it is. It's like, no, it is. And you only went there for a year and you didn't go through the conversion therapy program, but okay. But he has this scene in the article, and he paints this picture of when this one professor, Karen Pryor, who's no longer there, she's an English professor. She was the chair of the department when I was there. But he was in one of her classes and she says to him, hey, I want to talk to you after class and come to my office. So he's like, okay. So he goes to the office and Karen Pryor says to him, so what do you want to talk about? And he's like, you called me here. And she's like, I know, but what do you want to talk about? And essentially she coerces him into telling her that he's gay. And it's like the weirdest, most like bizarre, like, none of your business. And why do you feel so, like you need, that you even have like the platform or the allowance to ask him or make him feel like he has to tell you? It's so weird. But in there, when she says to him afterwards, like he says, I'm gay. And I think if I remember correctly, he starts crying and she's like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And this idea of it's going to be okay, because she's a homophobe. She's someone who signed the Nashville Statement, which was the Southern Baptist declaration that they still don't believe that being gay is okay. It was this document that was written, I think, 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And it's like, no one asked Southern Baptist Convention, like, stop telling us your views. No one cares. But she's one of the main signers of the Nashville Statement. So she still holds fast to this belief. She still also tweets about it. She's like, some people think I'm liberal in it, but meanwhile, I'm anti, equality. And it's like, you're touting that like it's something to be proud of. Bizarre. But anyway, so this moment where she says to Brandon in this article, she's like, it's going to be okay. I've thought a lot about that. And I've thought a lot about what those words are saying. And I thought about that in other contexts when I think about Pastor Dane as someone who said the same thing. It's going to be okay. You will, you're going to find victory in Christ. Things will, work out for you. And on top of that, even just statements where she says, I love you, because in the article, I believe she says, I love you as well. And Pastor Dane always said he loved us. And it's like, what is that love? Yeah. Right? Like, what exactly is that love that these people are professing? Because when I think about love, I think about it as a form of, in many ways, acceptance. And I'm not saying that I accept every single part of every single person I know. I know that I have some really great friends or whatnot who have some pretty wild beliefs, and I don't love that. But that's having a belief or is very is separate from just part of who they are, right? So like, it's like if I have, a friend who's a woman, I'd be like, if I said to her like, hey, I love everything about you, I just don't love that you're a woman. She'd be like, excuse me? So you don't love me because I am a woman. So it's like when someone says to me, Luke, I love you, but I don't love that you're gay. It's like, nope, let's rewind and let's backtrack to what this love is, because love does not compartmentalize parts of who you are as a person, right? And it's this bifurcated or divorced, love where it's like, I love part of you, but I don't love this other part of you. I like this and I don't like, you're compartmentalized, you're divided, you're segmented. And when someone does that to you, again, when it's your very person that is being divided, they don't love you. At least that love's not full. It's incomplete and it's lacking, and it's insidiously lacking. And I think that when people have this claim that they love, we love the gay community. It's like, first, like you have like one gay friend, and two, it's like you don't really love the gay community, because if you love the gay community, you wouldn't wish for its extinction, right? Like when you have these people who say like, oh, I love the gay community, and there are these Christians who are like out there evangelizing, trying to change them, right? This is like, I mean, what I do is I study the Holocaust mostly. But, of course, the Holocaust is a part of a greater, what's the word? It's part of genocide study. The Holocaust studies is part of genocide studies, right? And there's this one article that I've read recently, and it's just phenomenal. And I don't even think it's ultimately that recent that it was written. But so in this article, it's called Genocidal Intentions. It's all about how the desire for gays to be changed to straight or to be attracted to women, that this is a form of genocide. That again, if you think about like stripping this person of their culture, right, to remove gays from their like the queer culture, to strip them of their language in a way, right? Not to say like gays have a different, well, some of us have a different language, I suppose. It's some of the words we use, but like to strip them of their language, strip them of their culture, to strip them of their very being. right? This is a form of trying to suppress an entire community and get rid of an entire community, because ultimately conversion therapists, if they could have their way, the gay community would not exist. And that is a genocidal intention, right? That is a desire for an entire group of people to be erased. And that is exactly why I do my work that I do about conversion therapy and Liberty Now, because I want to expose these folks for exactly who they are. These are people who want me as a person to be gone. Right. And to know that there are people out there who desire your erasure, who desire your extinction as, again, as a group, it's wild. And it's something that I think needs to be talked about. So
I think from, like internally thinking about the mindset that they're coming from, like you've been saying, they'll decouple the person from being gay. So it's easy for them to do. But I think what they'd want to say to some of the things you're saying there is like, if someone's a pedophile or a rapist or something, do we just accept, like that's, and they say it's a part of them, do we just accept them? And I certainly do disagree with the comparison of being gay to being like a pedophile and all the, but the problem is I guess you've kind of got to meet people where they're at with those ideas. Like what would you want to say to someone who's kind of thinking like that about do you have
first of all, it is always fun to be compared to a pedophile. It's always a good one. Right? A pedophile or a rapist. I mean, I think with both of those instances, again, just to think for a quick second, when people, that's what I always say to people, like, just think, like, right? Just like think for a quick second about the very nature of your comparison. And let's think about the terms of a pedophile, of a rapist, and then of a gay person, right? The terms of a pedophile and a rapist are that it's non-consensual sex, right? It's where these people, there's a power differential, where there's one group who doesn't have the ability to say no, or they might say no, but it's not listened to. And then with, of course, a gay couple, or just gays in general, when there's some sort of consensual relationship that they're entering into, it is consensual by definition. Right? Like and so I think that there's that. I think that, again, you think about the long-term effects and violence of rape. When you have people who experience PTSD and they have, again, like what I study in large part is trauma. And so thinking about trauma and what results in trauma, these are moments where it's where whatever happens to you is in the moment, the action or the act that is done to you is so enormous, it's so extreme, it's so big for your brain to take in that it breaches the boundaries of what your brain can normally take in, to the point where you can't even you can't make sense of it, right? And that's why people oftentimes, after they've been traumatized, they go back to the site of trauma, the origin of trauma, and they repeat things, they reenact things, almost because it's trying to give voice to what happened, because when it happened in the moment, it was too extreme to actually take in, and it was too extreme to narrativize, that ultimately afterwards, by acting out, and again, it's literally acting and reenacting what happened, it's a way of trying to give voice to it, or embody, or even in an embodied sense, to what happened. And so when you think about that, when people are raped or when people are molested, versus when you have a gay couple who engage in consensual sex, or just a really great, coffee date, or putzing around in a decor section of a department store, as we gays do, I think that's when you see that there isn't enduring trauma, right? So from a psychological perspective, not the same thing. From a power-based perspective, not the same thing. And so I think that I think it's also very easy to make these claims about the gay community when you don't know gays, right? Yeah, right. When you have,
because you don't have to humanize them. You don't. It's not. Yeah.
Right. And oftentimes we're not humanized, right? If you think about the language that's used to describe gays, we're described in animalistic terms. I look at those filthy pigs. Look at those disgusting animals, right? Those dogs. One time, my ex, he came from a really religious family, and he overheard his his brother-in-law saying about us, like, we're just like two filthy dogs having sex.
Right. Okay.
And I was like, you don't even know if we have sex, but okay. Right. So with this comparison, the way that we're talked about, again, it shows the language we use to describe the gay community, or the way that, a lot of folks used to, the language they use to describe the gay community, again, reflects how they don't see us as they're equal. And so I think that ultimately that's probably what I would say. Like, get to know a gay person first and foremost. And if, there is always that token one gay friend they have, but don't actually ever engage in conversations that matter, or pardon me, that don't matter in regards to sexuality. Or I would say the psychological ramifications, as well as the power-based differential in these relationships.
So do you have any thoughts about why it is that our culture sort of does look at homosexual relations as like so differently to heterosexual relations? Like, for me, like one thing that really hit this home for me was I was reading, there was like a philosopher called Aristophanes who he wrote a play about Socrates called The Clouds, which is like a kind of like making fun of Socrates because he's always got his head in the clouds with all these questions. And another of the myths that Aristophanes sort of had was that every person was like half a person, and there's like a second half of a person that they're meant to like join with. But in the story, it's not like so there's like for every man there's a woman, and that's why there's men and women. No, he's like, and for some men there's another man, and for some women there's another. And I was like, there's no homophobia, or like it was just accepted, like that's just how some people are. And the modern narrative seems to be well, actually it's unnatural for there to be people who are attracted to people who are the same sex as them. And I'm trying to avoid saying there are people who are same sex attracted as like the in-group language of
right.
But and I was thinking, well, when was it that it stopped just being like this thing, because obviously there's other historical cultures as well who have viewed homosexuality as like this alien thing, but why is it that in some cultures it's just been like, yeah, that's how people are, or this thing that's fine, and in other cultures it isn't? And specifically for our culture today, why is it that we view it differently? I mean, is this just a random throwback to like the Christian sexual ethics of the past 200 years, or does it come from something else? Have you got many thoughts around that?
I think first of all, I mean, it's important to like talk about it in the context of today, and then I like the idea of like finding a genealogy as to why this is the way. Right. Why do we think about it? Oftentimes, gays are reduced to a sex act, right? We're reduced to they have anal sex, and it's like, again, you don't know my sex life, right? But this is something that today, when I came out to my mom, oh my word, it was this like string of text messages, a lot of which were spelled incorrectly, but we put that aside. I said, know your audience, Cheryl. But she said in these text messages, as well as these phone messages, as well as when we did actually talk, she just went on and on and on about all of what she imagined to be my sex life, and using really descriptive, like real descriptive terms. Yeah. And I was like, why are you thinking about this? And, this is, I think, the way that oftentimes gays are framed, is as we are simply just sexual beasts, right? That we are defined by what we do in the bedroom. Right. Which is not always the case. And that's not always what you see with straight people, right? But what you do see a lot of the time is that women are also sexualized in a very, I wouldn't even say, well, I guess in some ways particular, but again, a lot of how women are seen is mapped onto how the gay community is seen, and vice versa. And so I think about, when a woman's, wearing something that is, she's scantily clad, she's seen as, her body. She's seen in embodied terms. Right. She's just legs. She's just breasts. She's just lips. She's just whatever. And same with the gay community, right? We're seen oftentimes in our corporeal form. We're seen as, or we're perceived. The rest of us doesn't matter. Yeah. Right. The rest of who we are, and if we're kind, or if we're smart, or if we're whatever, in the heteronormative imagination, we are seen as sex acts. We're seen as physical bodies. And so I think that the way that women are treated, the way that women are seen, the way that women are sexualized, is comparable to, again, there are obviously differences, but comparable to the way that the gay community is seen. And so I think about, if you think like the sort of way that women have been seen in, as emotional, again, gays are seen as emotional. Men straight men, but men, real men, are those who are heady. Those are the ones who are smart. They're wise, right? That they're, and then so it's this the opposition between mind and body is oftentimes split, or at least gendered, where the mind is masculine and the body is feminized. And I think that women are these emotional, feeling creatures that are the temptresses, right, throughout history. It's Potiphar's wife who's trying to, get her boy, and it's all these like women who are the temptresses. And so I think that the way that women are seen as sexualized, and the way that femininity is seen as then therefore lesser because the mind is seen as higher or better or more noble, I think that maps onto and allows us to understand homophobia in some ways, that at least illuminates certain aspects of homophobia, which is sexism, which is a hatred ultimately of women. And ultimately, if we were to break that down even further, is this hatred of femininity, right? Because if you even think about like homophobia towards women versus men, those are two different sorts of homophobia, right? Against lesbians or gays, right? That there's this difference in how they're seen, and even just where people feel safe more, around certain groups and not around other groups, right? The gays are seen as lecherous, as these, these people who are out to get you, and straight men feel just so uncomfortable. I couldn't be even in a room with a gay guy. It's like, trust me, judging by your like bootcut jeans and like your ill-fitting shirt, I want nothing to do with you. And you're wearing Hollister goods, sir. Like, you better believe I'm not interested. However, it's like that gay men are seen as these, they're out to get you. Same with women, right? Same with, if you think, then you think about racialized communities, right? You think about, black men, they're out to get, our white women. Think about Jews during the Holocaust. There's, and before the Holocaust, all the propaganda that was framing them as these, these
insidious,
sexual, that's it, right? And so you see all these, really all this is to say is that, black folks, Jews, gays, women, all these minorities are seen really similarly, and the structures that undergird the hatred towards these communities is so comparable, and it's really not in any way surprising, because it's they just recycle these weird scripts about minorities because they're different and they're just not used to them, and they're nervous around them because they don't know them as well. And I think that now that we see within popular culture like a growing acceptance of gays, of there's of other communities. Think of, pick your minority, and in this case, the minority I am is gay, and so it's like there's this growing acceptance because there's more exposure, there's more, they're talked about more. And I think that in part, like what pushes against homophobia is seeing more queer representation, and what that even means. Because oftentimes people are like, if queer representation is good, it's like, okay, why? And I think why? Because it's actually showing people, even if they're characters in a show, it's humanizing them, right? And if they don't have anyone in rural Arkansas who they know is gay, they at least have people on Glee, which I just finished the season finale 5 years late, and it was phenomenal. And I really wish it didn't end. But that's besides the point.
No, that's a great point. So just for where we were though, talking about your experience with conversion therapy as well, we didn't really talk about at what point did you start to think, this is weird or this is inappropriate, and at what, was it that you doubted Christianity as like a metaphysical system that aligned with how the world is or whatever? Or was it that, sometimes for some people it can be that, well, the life advice that they got led to like really bad outcomes, and so that caused them to doubt Christianity in it, which is different from maybe just thinking about the proposed truths don't align up with what I'm experiencing or something. Like, how is it for you? Was it that and how was that deconstruction process? That that sometimes people struggle with the idea of spiritual warfare, and that those doubts are to do with that, or what happened in your case?
Spiritual warfare reminds me of Frank Peretti, that Christian author who used to talk about they're like demons and like pull it like in the back of our head. Anyway, all that fun stuff. So for me, it actually, the first question you would ask is something along the lines of, when did you, start to push against conversion therapy or see it as something different than what I initially saw it as? It was at McMaster. So I went after Liberty, I went straight to my MA at McMaster, and it was there because I'd lived so thoroughly comfortably within the evangelical world. The evangelical world was my normal. I was living under this different sacred canopy of Christianity versus everyone else's, of course not. And so everything within that seemed very normal. It seemed like this was this was just life. And so when I went to conversion therapy, again, it's not like I advertised it. I wasn't telling people I was going. I told a few people and I told a few friends, but like really close friends, but I didn't really go past that. And so when I got to McMaster, I think that some of my colleagues were just like, who the hell is this guy? He just seems like a very, because I was the kid who came from the States. I'm Canadian, but again, I had just moved from Lynchburg, Virginia, and I wasn't prepared well at all. Liberty did not offer me an education that prepared me for a graduate school, which was a huge issue, and that's a whole other story.
Right. Okay.
They're academics, but I got to school and I was sharing an office with a few friends, and I remember I shared with one friend that I went through conversion therapy, and I didn't. If anything, I was more embarrassed that I had gone through it. Not that, of course, the embarrassment shouldn't have been placed on me. It should have been placed on Liberty. And my friend, when I kind of, told her, my colleague that I told her that I went through conversion therapy, she was like, "You went through what?" And it was, I remember seeing her reaction made me realize this wasn't
right.
Wasn't normal. And I started sharing with a few other friends at McMaster, and same thing. They were like, "Luke, like, what the heck happened to you?" And I started thinking more and more of it. And then I got to Vanderbilt, where I did my other master's. And it was there that same thing. It was almost this compassion that it was compassion that people were showing, where they were saying like, "That's not okay. That's terrible." Yeah. And I started realizing that my experience was not normal. And so I think in large part it was because of leaving the bubble, what they call the Liberty bubble, and then also in a lot of ways leaving the Christian bubble. Though I was leading a youth group in Hamilton. Like I was, for all intents and purposes, the youth pastor, but it wasn't really it wasn't an official title. But every Friday night I was leading this youth group, and so I think that. For me, when I got to McMaster, it was encountering differences of opinion, people who had different experiences, different lives than I did, that pushed me to start to consider my firmly held beliefs and what I thought was normal. And so it was actually not my sexuality, to answer your second question, that pushed me from Christianity. It was the Holocaust. So again, I studied the Holocaust. Mostly what I study is the transmission of trauma from survivors to their children, to their grandchildren. But before that, I did my first thesis was on Holocaust literature, and then I did some work on Nazi propaganda. And so, and all the while taking courses on the Holocaust. And so working with these texts and reading mostly the work of Elie Wiesel, it was actually Elie Wiesel's work that pushed me over the edge. And that's when I was doing my PhD. It wasn't even the years immediately after Liberty, because again, even then I was still struggling to reconcile my faith and my sexuality. And again, I think for anyone out there who is a Christian and is gay or lesbian or trans or any other part of the LGBTQ plus acronym, or falls under that umbrella, should I say, I think that it's absolutely possible to reconcile your faith. Granted, for me, like, it's not something I want. That's not a conversation I'm really interested in anymore. I don't care to do that. But if that is something that someone's invested in, sure. And it is possible. However, for me, it was not my sexuality that pushed me from Christianity. It was 100% my study of the Holocaust. Granted, my sexuality did offer a wedge into my binary understanding of the world, because once I accepted my sexuality, that no longer fully aligned with what I had been taught, that it was right, wrong, good, evil, of God, of the enemy. And I decided that I was going to accept myself for the first time, really, in a lot of ways, because I started thinking about how I was practicing my theology, which at the time it was I theologized first and then lived. And I hoped that my lived reality would fit with my preconceived notions, versus I was like, let me just live first and then theorize or theologize afterwards. Right. Okay. So because again, I like to say that theology, after all, is theory, right? All of what we're doing when we're theologizing is theorizing about the divine. We're theorizing about God. And so I got to Florida. I still am doing my PhD in Florida. I'm just not living in Florida. I'm dissertating from Toronto. But when I was living in Florida, I was sitting on my couch one time and I was reading some of Elie Wiesel's work. Elie Wiesel is a really well-known Holocaust survivor. His work, Night, is perhaps his best known work. He won the Nobel Prize. He's just a phenomenal human. He died was it 2016? I believe it was 2016. Anyway, Wiesel. So I was reading his work, and he's unrelenting with God. Like, he never lets up. And because of his experience in during the Holocaust, his faith, of course, changed, and it was profoundly different. But he never gave up being a Jew, which is, of course, separate from my faith journey. But for him, even I believe it was a New York Times article he wrote, and it was essentially saying, like, he says to God, it's this prayer. He's like, God, can we just figure this out? Like, can we just do this? Like, can we finally just talk about what happened? Like, can we just know, your role? Where were you, during the Holocaust?
Yeah.
So for me, it was Elie Wiesel's unrelenting pressure that he put on God, and I think from what it was the breaking point for me was actually. Which is so funny that this didn't come years earlier, but this is, of course, just the way it was. I was thinking about the phrase, because I heard someone talk about, they said something about they were blessed because they gotten a free coffee at Starbucks. And I sat there and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Because I was like, let's break this down. Okay, so-and-so, let's call her Becky. Becky has gotten a free Starbucks from coffee because God blessed her. That means that God went out of God's way to bless Becky with a free Starbucks coffee. So that means that's an active bestowal of God's love. So God actively did that. So that means that when God acts, God is therefore active. That also means that God at other points is not active, which is also a decision. I always tell my students when I teach writing, I say every word you put on the page is a decision. So if God at some points is blessing some people, that's a decision. And other points, God's not blessing other people at other points. That's also a decision. Just in the same way a student puts a word on the paper or doesn't put a word on the paper, both decisions. So that means that God's giving some blessings at other times, not at other times. So that means that God's actively not helping out certain groups, communities, whatever, and individuals, of course. And I thought to myself, so God is giving Becky a coffee, but not helping so-and-so in, pick your moment of violence, pick your atrocity, pick your even, just kind of a crummy situation that someone's in, right? Yeah. If that's the case, God has a lot to own up to. Where's God when so-and-so is hurt and suffering versus when so-and-so is getting a coffee?
Right.
Like, give me a freaking break. Like, that to me was this moment where I could no longer accept. And again, this realization should have come so much earlier, but this was what happened. And I just think to myself, I can't get on board with a God who acts in a world sometimes and for only seemingly some people. And in some ways, not even for some people, right? It's confirmation bias again. Becky probably had a crummy day the day before and the day before that, but God gave her a coffee. So, she's going to forget about those crummy days, but then just think, oh, God's good. And you're like, God's good to you on some days. And God's not good to a lot of people on most days. So where is this God? Who is this God? I don't want to know this God. Right. And I think for me, it's not where I don't believe in God. Like, I do believe in God. But I don't believe in the God that I've been told about. I don't believe in the God that people told me to believe in. Because that God doesn't align with my lived reality or a lot of people's lived realities. Because my life's pretty decent for what it is. But a lot of people don't have lives like me. And if that's the case, like, who am I to say that there's a God that's loving and good in the same way that Christians frame him or her or them? Well, in Christianity, it's him. But, I can't get on board with that. Again, I do believe in God. I think ultimately I believe I'm more of like a deist, right? Where I'm like very Thomas Jefferson about things. I'm like, God created the world and stepped the heck back.
Right. Yeah.
So
I think the especially difficult part with like that kind of classical theism is perhaps the idea that this, like you were saying, this God's aware of all these things, choosing to act, at least on, what many Christians see as like providence in like a cup of coffee or whatever, choosing to act in those situations, not acting in the other, like you said, trivially bad or like really, really bad situations. But then the idea then that in the afterlife of, like there's going to be people who basically didn't accept Jesus, which are the necessary conditions for being saved on their view, but just through ignorance or make these bad moral choices just through almost environmental factors and suffer as a result of it just because of almost where they're born, but then receive infinite punishment and that's the really messed up part of that particular belief. Like for where I'm at personally, thinking about that whole thing, it's like maybe, like the only way I could square any of that away is if like one day it literally, like these kind of like soul building defenses and things where it's like, well, one day it all made sense and everyone was actually the better for that suffering. But anything other than that just seems to me, like you can't have like a morally perfect being who would, in my view, who would be aware of those things and then like sending some of those people to hell forever because of them not reaching the right conclusions in like horrible circumstances.
But Nathan, I think that's part of it too, right? What makes Christianity so
motivating, like powerful. Yeah.
Right. That I believe at the end of the day, I believe that if I don't follow what God is, telling me to do, or what, again, the Bible is telling me to do, and even that, like, is the Bible telling me to do that, or is my interpretation? Of course, this is, there's so many layers to it. If I don't do what apparently, so-and-so, this pastor, or, this spiritual leader in my life is saying to do or to believe, then I'm going to hell. And again, I think when I think back on my own experience, what kept me so tied to evangelicalism was the threat of eternal punishment, right? That I constantly had the hellfires burning beneath my feet, because I thought if I slip up or if I start living the gay lifestyle, whatever that is, my life's just as boring as straight people. But, if I'm living that big old gay lifestyle, that I'm going to go to hell. Yeah. My word, that's a pretty effective way to keep you in line, right? And you have that threat over your head for so long. It's pretty terrifying on a daily basis.
And did you struggle with that idea after, at whatever point you kind of decided maybe this isn't true, or maybe going back and forth a bit? And was this something you were like psychologically struggling to get to grips with? I'm making a choice where I'm choosing hell or something, or I don't know, like what was that a thing you had to address, like psychologically? Or
yeah, I remember the first time I met. This was at Vanderbilt. I met someone who was training to be a pastor, and she didn't believe in hell, and I remember being like, what kind of Christian are you? She was like Episcopalian, that's who, or that's what type I am. And I remember thinking that was just wild. Like who does she think she is to get rid of hell? Right. But it was this slow journey and again, it's this slow deconstruction where even the fact that it took me till I was 27 to start separating myself fully from Christianity. I mean, it just shows you how strong and influential this thinking really can be, and maybe just is in a cultural or a greater sense, right, for Christian culture and cultures within the West. And so it was a really slow process. It was a really tough process, because again, it's almost like when you're a kid, the floor is lava. And you have to you don't want to take a step. Like, what if the floor turns into lava? Yeah. And you're really terrified to take that step. And then you take the step and it's solid ground. And then you take the next step and you're like, oh my gosh, that's solid ground and it's not lava. Yeah, and, it was kind of like that, where it was this constant testing of reality, of my life, of my lived realities, or reality, pardon me. Maybe there's realities. Maybe I have multiple realities. Who knows? But I remember it was this slow journey of beginning to test the waters in certain areas. And even with things like saying, oh my God, I mean, I don't really say, oh my God, still, it's kind of hardwired in me in a lot of ways, but things like that, where if I ever said it before, I felt just like that, affective, terror. Whereas now it's like nothing happened, and not to say before I thought that I was going to be burned to death or anything, obviously not. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. There's just these little things that I think that add up over time. And then again, when you're having enough conversations with enough people, especially people who are different from you, who challenge you to think otherwise, it's very helpful. And I wouldn't be I wouldn't be who I am today if it weren't for these other conversations with these other people who challenged me to think hey, Luke, if you do this, it's not like you're going to just go to hell. And I was like, well, you don't know that because you don't know God. And then all of a sudden, again, not that I'm dead yet, but just having these conversations that opened up other realms of possibility were huge.
Yeah. So if there's anyone who's kind of listened to your story and this whole thing, and say if they're a Christian who has sort of like had feelings towards the same sex or feelings about their sexuality that are different from maybe the normal heterosexual kind of is, or if they're involved in any way with this kind of theology of like conversion therapy of that. I see it as like in-group, like language signaling when people like they're struggling with same-sex sin or something like that. If there are Christians who are listening to that, what would you want to say to them? You know, like how would you want them to deal with this topic, deal with people like yourself? What would you want them to know?
Mm-hmm. First of all, it's funny that you say that, the idea of like having those the in-group language, like these signals, because they are signals. I remember when I was at Liberty, he was actually he was one of the few people I came out to early at Liberty. This guy, one of my friends, I won't use his name, but he and I were, he knew that something had happened on my dorm. He knew that my spiritual life director and I had some sort of rift, and he was like, he's like, do you want to talk about it? And I was like, no, like, I don't want to get into the details. Like, I don't want you to judge me for what, blah, blah, what went down. And he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, if I'm too specific with you, then like, I'm going to be embarrassed because I don't want you to know like the truth. And so, I said to him though, I said, but I did write a poem. I said, can I read you a poem? So read this poem that I had written about this experience with this guy not talking to me anymore. And afterwards, he always had these like funny, these lips, like his lips were kind of like weird when whenever we talked about anything gay, is weird. His lips just got kind of weird. And he was like, I think I know what you're talking about. And, lips.
Right.
And I said, oh shoot, like maybe I was too explicit in this poem. And I said, you do? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, he said, like, can you explain to me more about what it's about? And I said, no, again, like, I don't want to tell you because I don't want you to judge me if I tell you, if I reveal what happened. And he said, well, here's the thing. I think I struggle with the same thing. And of course, struggling in Christianese is, it can be used in a number of contexts, but the way that, again, it was like all these there were other clues that were pointing towards when he said struggle, I was like, wait a second, I think we might be talking about the same thing here. And so then back and forth, it was kind of this like fumbling, awkward, like, do we, I struggle with same-sex attraction. I vomited out. And so, I think that it absolutely is, there's language there that signals, anyway, that's just I think it is really interesting. I often hear sort of, I'm trying to think of a few off my head, but it's kind of like, like your walk with the Lord, like that kind of thing. Like you just, especially when I watch like Christian YouTube channels and things, that you just hear this language coming up, and it's very interesting how it's just this internal like signaling mechanism or something that like it's almost often very like if you were to say, well, what does that refer to? What's like the referent of that? It's very difficult to like. Like the walk with the Lord. What is it? Do you just mean reality or life or exist? Like, But it's even funny in like dating when I've gone on like some dates with guys who mostly in the States, actually, less in Canada, less so in Canada, but in the States, you'll go on dates and guys will say things and you'll say, and I'll just say like, you were raised in the church, weren't you? And they're like, yeah, how'd you know it? I'll be like, well, it's the language you're using. It's so clear. But yeah, so what I would say to these folks, I mean, there's so much, right? Like for me, again, it wasn't, and my goal is never to get people to like renounce their faith. I don't care what people believe. Like I really don't, as long as what they believe isn't hurting others.
Yeah.
Right. So it's never like what I do or what I say or what I write is to discredit anyone's faith system. No, it's only to make their faith system better. It's only that they take into consideration how their faith system can be a part of a larger system that really damages and hurts a lot of people. Yeah. And so there's that. So like whatever I do say, it's not to like get that person to like renounce their faith. I just don't care. I just care that it's better and that they're better for it. And so, I mean, I would start with a lot of like questions just about scriptural interpretation, like how, like what are people's hermeneutics and like, what do they say about scripture? And what's the relationship to scripture? Are these words about God? Are these God's words? Like what exactly do they believe? Yeah. And I think that conversation because I always say to, I have people from, mostly from Liberty actually, who reach out to me and say like, hey, can we talk sometime? I'm, you know, a gay person and I'm thinking through these questions. And I've had like a number of people who have reached out, which has been cool. And I normally start the conversation with questions about scripture. Like what do you believe in scripture? What do you think, God said, or did people say about God? And like having these conversations after that, it is that your faith is not mutually exclusive with your sexuality. Your sexuality, again, I think that, you know, in the ways that even Jesus describes himself as like a mother hen at one point, right? There's the Shekinah glory, which is considered a more feminine energy within God or anyway, Hebrew Bible interpretation versus, you know, Christian interpretation, or Jewish interpretation, should I say? But I think that God's genderful. God's not one gender, and so, you know, even this like translation of he, him, and whatever when we're referring to God and God the Father, I think that's something that is something to just think about. That, you know, your gender identity and also your sexuality are not aberrations from God, that they're actually part of God if we believe God to be this full, inclusive, loving being. I would also say that, you know, it is, again, like in addition to considering how people approach the Bible, which is foundational to this entire conversation, but also thinking about who they're reading and who they're listening to, right? If we're only reading authors who are a part of the Southern Baptist tradition, or if we're only reading authors who, you know, are, you know, parts of or pastors of mega churches, or, you know, what's his name? Kenneth Copeland, is that his name? The pastor in Louisiana, I think it's his birthday today. If I'm not mistaken, happy birthday. What is his name? Brother Copeland. But putting, you know, I think that if you're only listening to certain people, of course you're only going to be entertaining certain thoughts, right? About God, about spirituality, about sexuality. And so you know, the idea of reading someone who's different from you, I would also say, like, check out books by people who are maybe kind of like you, but maybe kind of not. I can think about Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian, this book that he comes from an evangelical perspective. Like, he doesn't abandon his evangelicalism, but he does abandon the way that evangelicalism has understood sexuality for the past 100 or so years. And so, you know, there are so many people out there, and there's so many, you know, folks to talk to as well, to have conversation partners with people who are different. That's huge. I mean, I just think to myself that when you have folks who are a part of these very particular conversations or a part of these very particular communities that don't really branch out into other areas. And again, if someone's listening to this podcast or this, you know, this show, they probably are starting to explore things, which is great. But at the same time, you know, most of the time people don't reach out or don't branch out, should I say, past what they're comfortable with. But again, push your comfort level. If God's so big and if God's so, you know, powerful, then I think God can handle you listening to a few podcasts or reading a few books or articles or whatever, right? If you're worried that your faith's going to be troubled, maybe your faith isn't all that strong. And maybe you should question why your faith isn't all that strong, right? And you should think about what's making me nervous to engage with other people or to read other people, you know, because it's one thing to talk to someone, but it's also another thing that's not as active to just listen or to just read, right? So, and again, no one's forcing you to believe what they say, but at least start considering, at least start thinking, and think again about your lived reality. Think through your experiences, not just through theology, right? If we're only thinking through theology and we're not thinking through how we live and actually going out there and, you know, going on Tinder, going on a date, what harm is that? Again, like, no one's forcing you to do anything on those dates, but again, to put yourself in situations where you are living first and thinking after, in a way, not to say like do something reckless, obviously, but like, I think like the idea of theologizing through our lived experiences first, and then theorizing after about what we think the meaning behind whatever, you know, activity or whatever experience is or was afterwards. And so I think that these are things that I think were super helpful for me in how I navigated my faith journey, how I've navigated not just my faith journey but my life in general, engaging with people who are different, trying to understand people who are different. Especially if those differences are something that I see that are actually not so much differences, but similarities that I'm just pushing down and saying that's not like me, but I wish that were like me, but I also wish it weren't like me because I think that it's wrong to be gay, but at the same time I want to be gay because that's who I am. But I think that when these were ways of reforming how I understood God, how I understood sexuality, how I understood myself, And I think that there are effective ways for other people to do the same.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff in what you just said there. Like, I like that idea, especially of like, you know, if that kind of God exists, right, and where all truth is God's truth, then you should be able to pursue any question with an open mind to the best of your ability, and whatever true conclusions you reach would be more like the character of that God. And I think in general, like this is just a general feature of human thinking and psychology. Like it's not just like being a part of Christian religion. It's like constantly being against our biases and like I remember in the kind of Christianity I was in, where we'd read like the Athanasian Creed every Sunday. And I remember I had a conversation with someone once, and I was like, "Oh, maybe we should read this by Athanasius." And this person was really into like John Piper, the Calvinist, and he was like, "Well, my understanding is that Athanasius was a heretic and stuff." And it's like, you know, that's literally the creed we read. You know, like there's all these really everything, like you were saying, is black and white, right? It's like I'm standing on the truth, I've got it, and there just isn't this this like, what's it, like an understanding of my own fallibility, because this is like an ultimate revealed truth, and it can't be questioned. Whereas like, yeah, I think it's great to encourage people. It's like, you know, it's not because I'm from I'm from Satan and trying to get you to question your beliefs. It's like it should lead to like a more what, I don't know, like a maybe a faith that's more like what you see in the character of Jesus, right? Rather than the people, you know, rather than the fancy metaphysics and the going in the temples and stuff, that the guy who's like living amongst the people. And it's not to say that that's necessarily what but I think that that's probably a better Christianity than the other sort.
More incarnational in a way, right? Where like to take God into the dark places, to take God to what's considered dark. And, you know, a gay bar is pretty dark according to some standards. Right. Why not go check out a gay bar for a quick second, right? Like after COVID and all that. I do. I think that you're absolutely right. It's a more robust faith. It's a more sincere and honest faith. And I think that for me, like what drew me away from the faith that I had for so long was an intellectual curiosity that ultimately said, you know, it wasn't satisfied within the church. And I think it was stifled within the church. It was circumscribed in the church in a way that was unproductive, in the way that ultimately I don't think the divine would want. And I do, again, I still believe in God. Who that God is, I don't really know. But what I do believe is that God wouldn't want me to stick within a tradition that not only actively worked against me as a person, but on top of that didn't allow for intellectual curiosity. And I, like you said, you know, you threw out some Augustine there, some all truth is God's truth. And if in fact that is true, if in fact all truth is God's truth, then don't be afraid of the truth. Don't be afraid of where it takes you, because ultimately God will be there too.
Yeah.
If in fact
I was just going to say, someone asked in the chat earlier, do you think religion is the major factor here, or just like an excuse for, seems like homophobia is extremely common, I think they meant there, regardless of religion.
Can we put the question back up just so I can read it?
Yeah, sorry. Let me scroll back up. I just clicked off it and I don't know where it's gone now. There we go.
Straight. Oh wait, this is something separate. Yeah, that's the thing. It almost seems to me like straight people are scared to be attracted or something. You don't see much hate about asexuality, for example, although the arguments apply there too. That wasn't the right one. It was same person, earlier comment. Do you really think that religion is the major factor here and not just an excuse? It seems to me like homophobia. Sure. So I think I can think about my mom. When I came out to her, I was living in Nashville, and she was going to come down for Christmas because none of my siblings at the time were talking to her, and so she was going to come down for Christmas in Nashville. And all I wanted to do was go back home, but I said, you know what, Mom, if no one else is, because she was all upset about Christmas, and she's like, no one's going to come down and visit me, or to where she was living. She's like, everyone's upset with me. No one wants to talk to me right now. And I said, well, you know what, I'm talking to you. Why don't you just come to Nashville and we'll have a fun Christmas here? Because that'll at least get your mind off the fact that no one's talking to you. And so she was like, sure. So I then thought to myself, well, goodness, how am I going to explain like the setup of my apartment with my roommate? Okay, I have to come out. So I called her that night and I said, like, hey, Just so you know, when you come down here, I am, you know, I came out, I said I was gay. And she freaked out, hung up on me, and I woke up in the morning to a slew of text messages. And the text messages were saying things like Sodom and Gomorrah. And again, they were like spelled incorrectly. And I was like, oh man, this is like your spelling mistakes are in any way a reflection of your, again, like your thought out religion. Not looking good for you, Cheryl. But she was throwing out all these, like, again, references to the Bible. Though even when I asked her one time, I said, Mom, where is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible? And she was like, I don't know. And I was like, New Testament or Hebrew Bible? And she was like, I don't know. And I was like, okay, perfect. And so I think that religion maps onto homophobia really well. But I also think that it's this dual process, because again, the way that homophobia is constructed, I think, is in large part because of religion. But then religion, as a result, when you apply religion to homosexuality or to gay people, it's exclusionary, I think, definitionally, at least in that context. Again, according to certain understandings of scripture, I really don't actually even think that the Bible says, what even that means, the Bible says, or, you know, I don't even think that scripture lends itself well to homophobia. I really don't. But according to certain understandings, according to certain interpretations of scripture and certain translations of scripture where the word homosexuality is in it or not, I think that maps on really well to exclusionary exclusion of certain groups, right? Again, if you have an either or paradigm, right or wrong, then some groups are in, some groups are out. And so I think that it's not just, I think that religion lends itself very well, particularly conservative Christianity, to hatred. And that's what I would say about that.
Great. So I guess if we've been talking for about an hour and a half now, if we wrap it up around here, is there anything you want to say about like where people can find you, or anything that you're working on and that you'd want to promote if people want to hear more about your kind of like stories and thoughts on things?
Yeah, so let me find my Twitter. I still don't know my handle. On Instagram, I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. And then on Twitter, I'm at Wilson_FW. And then, am I on anything else? No, I mean, there's Facebook, like LinkedIn, that kind of stuff. But things where I'm active, that's my Twitter handle. And then on Instagram, I'm at Luke Slam Dunk Wilson.
Right, great. So I'll put those links in the description afterwards as well. It's been great talking to you and really interesting to see your story. But also, I think it's good to see how you've like integrated all those experiences into like becoming what seems like a better person, and now but also trying to like help other people through these things as well. Like you're not a victim of what happened or whatever. Not to say, but it, you know, like people, not to say people who struggle more or are victims are like, you know, like it's their fault or that, but I just mean it's good to see that some good has, like, you know, what man intended for evil.
Oh yes, I love a good use of scripture. No, I think that for me, like, what happened to me was not okay. What happened to me was not good. What happened to me was wrong. But do I live in the identity that I am a perpetual victim? No. Do I need to live in that identity? No. My life is much better by not. Again, I recognize that what happened to me was wrong, but I also, like you're saying, I want to do what I can to help other people live lives that are freer, are better, and not as restricted by a faith system that tells them that they're bad just for, you know, being who they are. Yeah.
Right. Well, I will end the stream there then. Thank you everyone for watching. If you have enjoyed, be sure to like the video, which helps the algorithm to get this out to more people. Thanks.